Yes,
Hey,
perfect.
how are you doing? Good to see you.
Ed.
Good evening.
Hi, Lar.
So,
Okay.
thank you so much, everyone, for being here for another week of 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. It's wonderful to see so many people joining us already. So, Lar and Ed, thank you both so much for joining us this evening. We've got Lar Joye of the Dublin Port, the Port Heritage Director and formerly Curator of the National Museum. So, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Oh, very happily. And then Ed, we're also delighted to be joined by Ed Jolliffe. During your career, you've acted as sommelier within Chapter 1, restaurant manager over in Glover Alley, and are now working as premium wines ambassador with the Santa Rita Group. So again, also thank you very much for being here.
That's a pleasure.
Good. Well, I'm delighted. I'm going to just kick into the evening straight away. So this evening we are tasting a Santa Rita Rose. Unfortunately, the sun is not exactly out to the extent that we had hoped. But you might start us off and set the scene for where we are for the evening and tell us a little bit about the wine that we're tasting.
Okay. Well, I suppose we were chatting about rosé yesterday, actually, and you know, the idea that the sun has to be shining for you to enjoy a nice glass of rosé. Yeah, I was just going to reach for mine there and go, you know, the product shop there. You know, that the idea that it has to be blisteringly hot and sunny to enjoy rosé has kind of gone out now a little bit, and people are now enjoying rosé all year round. And this I think is a cracking example. It's lovely, it's dry, and it's a beautiful modern style. It's a little darker than, say, I mean, I've spoken to, I remember doing an evening of wine pairing with a bunch of Michelin-starred French chefs, and I gave them a rosé that wasn't from Provence, and they all turned their noses up at it and said, "Oh no, rosé must be from Provence, and it must be very light in color. And what is this you are serving us?" But this is a little darker in color, you'll see, than your classic Provence rosé, which a lot of the time we say is kind of onion skin color, so it's much lighter. This has got a deeper pink, kind of salmon pink color to it, and just a beautiful fruit structure. So it's got, I get notes of strawberry and raspberry and a little bit of citrus in there, so a little kind of almost grapefruity kind of character, and that makes it incredibly refreshing. But it doesn't have to be, the sun doesn't have to be shining, and I'm sitting here in this room that if the sun was shining, it would be brilliant, but it's raining and it's miserable. But I'm quite happy because I've got a glass of this.
Very much so. It's no, I can get the strawberry notes that you're talking about. And this is a grape variety. Tell me a little bit about its background.
Well, this is made from predominantly Cabernet Sauvignon. So I suppose Chile is you know, Cabernet Sauvignon's Chile's you know, go-to grape. So it's 85% Cabernet Sauvignon. There's a little bit of Syrah in there as well, which just adds a little bit of refinement, a little touch of spice there as well. But the way it's made to be in that fresh, fruit-forward, easy drinking style. And it's not from a single vineyard or anything like that. It's from the Central Valley, so it's from a number of our different vineyards that we own. And as I say, made to be light and fresh and fun. Fresh and fun,
that sounds like our goal for the evening. It's well, now that I've got a drink in front of me and I know a little bit about what I'm drinking, thank you for that. Lar, I might come over to yourself. So Lar, this evening you're going to talk to us a little bit about the history of the Dublin Port, which is, I guess I'd love to just kind of set the scene. Could you take me right back to the beginning and to the founding of the port?
Sure. The port itself was established in 1707 as a committee of Dublin Corporation, and over the last 300 years, it's changed and evolved, and its names has changed. Dublin Port and Docks Board. The Docks Board would be the one that a lot of people in Dublin still kind of call the port. Since 1997, it's a semi-state. It's called the Dublin Port Company, but it traces the history back to 1707, and I'm very lucky. I started working there 2 years ago. And they have their archives and a lot of the kind of museum items also relating to that history going back as far as the 1700s. So it's a very long history, and since that time, in many ways, it's physically controlled the way that the city has expanded eastwards. It controlled the bridges, it controlled the ships coming in, the ships going out, but also building huge infrastructure from 1707 on. So the city, as you drive across it today from the north side to the south side, or south side to north side, that city in many ways has been designed by the port company and its earlier predecessors.
Okay, and Lar, I'm going to remember this incorrectly, but I remember once you brought me on a tour of the port and you were talking about walking from the entrance of the port down to its kind of conclusion would be the same distance as going from the port back up. How far into the city, just to give us a sense of the scale of it?
The modern port, which kind of extends from the east wall down to the end, to where the ferries go from to Wales, it's about 2.5 kilometres. So at its peak, when the port company controlled the whole of the docklands area from, if you like, from O'Connell Street Bridge down, you're probably looking at 5 kilometres. So a huge amount of real estate. And within that space, the company controlled the warehousing, controlled leases for various companies. And of course hired huge numbers of dockers, but also you had stevedoring companies working there hiring dockers. So there's a huge industry, if you like, right up into the 1970s based on unloading ships. And then also you had resulting industries in the local areas on the south docks and the north docks, where you had companies providing services and building things like cars in the area. So it's a huge area. It changed then and kind of went into decline in the 80s as ports became more streamlined with containerization, of course, roll on and roll off ferries. So kind of things changed quite dramatically. And that happened in ports all over the world. Again, they're not as large as they used to be. But at the same time, we're importing more material. So while there are less people employed in it, with mechanization, more and more materials coming in.
Okay, and so to everyone who's with us this evening, if you have any specific questions that you'd like to ask to Lar or Ed at any stage, please do type them in and I'll work my way through some of those questions over the course of the evening. And indeed, if you are participating and sampling in one of the wines this evening, let us know what you're tasting and how that's going for yourself. So Lar, I was doing a bit of research earlier this week, knowing that we were going to be speaking, and I found myself doing a bit of research on some of the key buildings within the city, and even going as far as, say, Wood Quay. An awful lot of the buildings that we see, and a lot of our iconic buildings up along the Liffey specifically, do have a strong relationship to the port. Does that really give us some insight into how the city has changed and evolved?
It has. I mean, if you look in and around the area, Temple Bar, that's where the original old custom house was, and that's in the 1600s. But the big buildings that you're talking about, and your wonderful exhibition on the Malton Prince that you had a couple of years ago, kind of displays that, if you like, with the forecourts in particular in that part of the city. But then, of course, the custom house, and with the building of the new custom house in the 1790s, that was really an argument among various people in the city at the time, merchants, developers, and the city fathers themselves, whether the port should stay where it is or should it start moving eastwards. The group demanding eastwards won out. Once the new custom house was built and then the custom house quays were built beside it, that saw the expansion going eastwards ever more since then. So if you like, from the 1790s to the present day, the city has been expanding more and more out. And then you also see within the Malton Prince the Hibernian Maritime School, which would have been on Sir Roger's Quay, roughly where the Samuel Beckett Bridge is now. And you also have that beautiful prospect of Capel Street Bridge, which again kind of shows you that when he's visiting Dublin, that very much the city is based around its river. And the river it connects it to the world. And what you see in this time of Dublin's history is that there's huge connections with Spain and France. But once the Act of Union happens in 1801, in many ways, that kind of commerce with the rest of Europe dies off. And what Dublin really becomes is a transshipment port for Liverpool. So everything is coming from Liverpool, everything's coming from Holyhead, and we're very enmeshed into the British Empire supply chain. But in the 1700s, right up to the Act of Union, you would maybe had, you would have had maybe 40 to 50% of trade with Irish merchants, with France and with Spain. But once after 1801, the Act of Union, we very much enmeshed into their system.
Okay, and I think when we're talking about, you've kind of spoken about here about the relationship between Ireland and Europe, and Ed, I'm going to ask you a kind of a slightly separate but related question. Well, in no way related, but linked question. The one of the things that I asked one of the winemakers a couple of weeks ago, but from a sommelier's point of view, I'd be really curious. Could you tell us a little bit about the relationship between New World wines and Old World, and kind of some of the differences and some of the relationships?
Yeah, well, I suppose New World wines and Old World wines, the New World is anything that's not Europe, essentially. So the Old World is, in terms of wine, is France, is Italy, is Spain, really. I suppose Germany and Austria could figure in there as well. And anything else that's New World is the New World. It's the colonies, if you will. So that would be Australia, the Americas, and everywhere else, South Africa. And I suppose stylistically, the wines from the New World tended to be, when they were planted back in, say, the 1600s or whenever, they were bringing European varietals to the New World, and they would just plant them wherever they thought that they could grow them, because it was much easier to grow grapes and make your own wine than have to transport it halfway across the world. And I suppose up until fairly recently, stylistically, if you had a preference for New World over Old World, it was that because the Old World tended to be more elegant, lighter in style, whereas New World wines, because they tended to be in warmer regions, tended to be richer and more full-bodied. But that, I think, that sticks in people's head to this day, I think. But, we've seen a big change, certainly in the last 20 years, in styles coming from some of these New World countries. And I suppose New World is a bit of a misnomer as well, because some of the oldest vines in the world are in Australia and in South America, particularly in Chile. So, what's new is now kind of old. And the style has changed. I mean, I'm doing a lot of work with wines from Chile, and my perception would have been of Chilean wines, good gluggers, but pretty powerful wines, generally speaking. But actually, the styles have changed within that to wines that are lighter, more delicate, more food friendly, and I suppose more Old World in style. And there are wines with great ageability and real finesse. Because I think in the past, the idea that bigger was always better. So if you had a wine that was more alcohol, more fruit, more sweetness, more oak, more of everything, and you try and cram as much as you can into it and extract as much as you can from the grapes. And we now know that that's not the way to go. And I suppose the analogy is with Coca-Cola, that it's really nice on a hot day to have a freezing cold glass of Coca-Cola, but you wouldn't drink the whole 2 liters of it. And the same with these big over-extracted wines where, the first sip may taste really good, but by the time you get to the end of the glass, you're kind of worn out and you don't want to have another glass of it. So, to have lighter, more refreshing wines, and wine is all about refreshment really, is the way forward. And there's been a big change in that thinking amongst winemakers in the New World, where people are now looking for lower alcohol, they're looking for more elegance and more freshness. And that's a good thing, I think.
It sounds like there's an awful lot of kind of change beyond what we would initially, or we as the consumer would have assumed, which I think kind of links back to what's been spoken about in the last couple of weeks, this idea that we should be curious about the wines that we're drinking, we should ask questions, we should taste, we should learn, and just be curious really. And I think you were talking about food and wine and the relationship there kind of briefly, and I wonder, from your own background, say, when I get to the point, or when any of our participants here get to the point at the end of this current circumstance when we can be hosting dinner parties again, would you have any couple of hints and tips, and from the perspective of someone who's kind of used to a fine dining environment, what would you be doing?
Well, I suppose you should go for what you like. I mean, that's the first thing. Go for what you like, but then you have to bear in mind that everyone's tastes are different. So some people like really light and delicate wine. Some people like heavy, rich wine. Some people like red. Some people like white. So don't get too hung up on it. Whilst the old adage of white wine with fish and red wine with meat still holds true, it's not written in stone. And as long as you know the rule, it's perfectly fine to break the rule. So if you want to drink red wine with your fish, then go right ahead. And conversely, if you want to drink white wine with your beef, then so be it. It's not a problem, you know. And I think people tend to get a bit worried around wine, particularly around more expensive and finer wines, that they're going to do something wrong. You know, there is no right and wrong, really. So, you know, just go with what you like. And, you know, it depends where you're shopping for your wine as well. If you're shopping in the supermarket, you don't have much help with your wine choice, and you possibly will just buy something that you recognize, or you might buy on price. But I'd recommend going to your local independent wine shop and getting to know the people who work in the shop, because they'll get to know your tastes, and they know their wines inside out. They will have tasted them all, and they'll know what you like, and they'll be able to match you up with whatever wines you like. And if you want to go on a bit of a journey, that's the way to do it. I mean, there's a lot of people who will go to the same wine shops over and over again and never buy the same bottle twice, because they just keep trying new and different things. And that's a lovely way to kind of learn about wine. I mean, the best way to learn about wine is through drinking it. So
I'm okay with that idea. And
yeah.
you had spoken to me earlier in the week when we were catching up briefly about this idea of weighting your food against your wine. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I suppose, you know, when you look at wine matching, one of the first things is the weight of the dish and the weight of the wine. So if you've got a very light salad, for example, you want to have a wine that's going to be light in body. So you don't want a big, heavy, oaky Shiraz, say from the Barossa Valley in Australia. You want something like a light Riesling from Germany, or a Sauvignon Blanc from Sancerre, or whatever. And conversely, if you're going to have a big, rich shank of lamb or something like that, you know, go for a Cabernet from Napa, or go for a big, rich, tannic red wine, because that's going to really, really work well together. So just think about, you know, the weight of the dish and the weight of the wine.
Okay, that sounds like some experimentation along the route, which is something that sounds fantastic. And Lar, I'm going to come back to you and ask one name that has come up an awful lot in some of the research that we've done around the port is this figure of Captain Bligh. I wonder if you could tell me who that is.
Well, Captain Bligh, of course, is famous because of the large number of movies that have been made about the mutiny on the Bounty, with some of the most famous actors in the world over the years. It tells the story of a captain of a small ship in the South Seas who's put into a rowing boat and basically is forced to row with a smaller crew. Some of the crew didn't want to mutiny for about 3,000 miles. Which he does quite successfully, and it kind of becomes a very famous incident in the 1780s. And as I say, it was written about straight away into the papers and then becomes the movies. So he's quite a controversial character. In 1800, he comes to Dublin and he's asked as a member of the Royal Navy to survey Dublin Port and Dublin Bay, because at that time, Dublin Bay was a very dangerous bay. It could take you 7 weeks to get into Dublin if the wrong winds were coming from, and as we're having at the moment, we have northeasterlies, nice cold weather, which means you couldn't get into the port. So everyone is trying to rectify this problem, because there's a problem on the east coast of Ireland is with our nice beaches that you have on the east coast. They're very long, very sandy, and they're very shallow. So trying to get depth on the east coast of Ireland is a problem. And he was the first surveyor of the bay where he actually did proper depths and actually was able to geographically work out all the aspects of the bay. And he also, like others, but he also suggested that what was needed was an extra wall. At that stage, the South Bull Wall had been built, which many people walk today, which is a 5.5 kilometre wall from Ringsend out into the bay. And what he was suggesting, and others were suggesting, was that one needs to be on the north side, and that eventually becomes the North Bull Wall. He didn't recommend specifically where the North Bull Wall is today, but he's one of many who suggested that happen. After that, he goes back into Royal Naval Service. He's involved fighting with Admiral Nelson in Copenhagen, and then later on, lucky for him, he's appointed governor of New South Wales. Unlucky for him, his name as a kind of a hard, principled captain meant there was another mutiny in New South Wales around 1806, which lasted for about 18 months, and he was actually imprisoned during this period. So he was an unlucky man. He suffered 2 mutinies. And then in the best traditions of the Royal Navy, there's only one thing you can do when a captain's had 2 mutinies: you have to promote him. So he was becoming a vice admiral and then becomes a rear admiral. So he was promoted out, and eventually he passes away around 1817. So he's one of those colourful characters, and every time you mention the bay, the South Wall, the North Bull Wall, his name kind of becomes mentioned. But ironically, he was only in Dublin for about 3 months. And he surveyed the bay, which is quite impressive, in October, November, and December, which can't have been the easiest time to be going out in a small, probably a barge or a smaller boat, and then taking depths, which he did with a small team. And then he produced a very detailed report. But as I say, people then associate the South Bull Wall, as he designed it and built it, or the North Bull Wall. The South Wall was well built at that stage. It was finalized in 1795. But the North Bull Wall was built eventually in 1819. I started working, it's finalized in 1825. And that's where you have Diamond Strand, and you kind of get the island that was built out of that. And it's very clever engineering that the port still relies on today. But basically, that causes a scouring effect. So the force of the Liffey coming down from the mountains forces out any sand or debris in the channel, and that creates depth. And throughout the 19th century, ships were getting bigger and bigger. What they needed was depth. So with a very simple kind of premise of the 2 walls, that creates a depth. It does occasionally have to be dredged even today, and it is dredged continuously in the 20th century. But by doing that, you get modern port, and that kind of overcomes that problem on the East Coast, where the coast is just too shallow. And if you are going to build ports on the East Coast, you have to kind of dig down, and then you have to kind of build great barriers out of the sea and breakwaters. So it was a very novel and simple principle to kind of create depth and create the modern port. And in many ways, that's why the port is still here. It's down to the 2 walls. It works. It's a very efficient way of keeping the port open, and that's why the port now would be the premier port in the country.
So beautiful walks to be had along the.
I would, a bit like the wine we're having tonight. On a nice summer's day, I would recommend taking a bottle of the wine and going out on the South Wall. But for some reason, it's about 10 degrees outside, and I'm contemplating putting the heat on in the next 20 minutes. But anyway.
It is a little bit like that at the moment, but we will get back to the summertime. So Captain Blythe, you're talking about kind of the up till about 1820, but then a few decades later, around 1886, we come to what's known as the golden era down at the port. What happens then?
Well, the main thing that happens in the middle of the 19th century is the introduction of railways. So the first railways in Ireland are the Dunleary Railway, but the Kingstown, as it called at the time. But what happens for Dublin after the Act of Union isn't as economically strong as it was prior to that, and it goes into a decline. But the railways are all centred into Dublin. So 4,000 kilometres or miles of railway are built in a very short period in the middle of the 19th century. And they're all connected into Dublin. And when they're connected into Dublin, they're all connected into the port. So the port benefits from the railways. So when you're driving along the North Quays today and you go past the convention centre, that was a railway depot. When you go past the Three Arena, or the Point as I know it, that was a railway depot. The remains of one of the hotels, which has a preservation order, which is being turned into a new hotel or being upgraded. So all that infrastructure on the North Wall was to allow people to come by train to Dublin, to go onto packet ships and then go to Holyhead. So technically, by the time you're talking about, you could leave Tralee on the 7 o'clock train and find yourself in London that night. We talk about being a connected world today and the importance of planes, but essentially in a 12-hour period, you could find yourself coming to Dublin very quickly on an express train, transferring to the ferry if you're a first-class passenger. It was a nicer trip, and then the Holyhead run has not really changed. It's 3 hours, 3.5 hours. Then it's the same today. Then you picked up an express train at Holyhead and you were in London 3 or 4 hours later. So, with that infrastructure, the port became, again, a key supplier, regrettably, for immigrants, for cattle, were the kind of 2 things we associate for export in Ireland. Then importing, and that's the kind of everything that we needed was coming in through the port at that stage onto trains and then brought around the country into this amazing network, which survived until the 1940s and 1950s and then started to close down. At the same time, the port then introduced its own power station, electrified. The cranes became electrified along the quays. And that sped up the whole process of importing and exporting. So it became a very efficient company. At that time, it would have had a series of very famous engineers who kind of built and extended the port. Bloodstone was probably the most famous. And a father and son team called the Halpins. So again, they were the kind of people who led this kind of expansion throughout the 1800s and this golden era. Once you kind of get to the independence in 1922, with the introduction of custom houses, the port in many ways goes into a decline for a lot of the 20th century. And isn't as successful as it was in the 1800s.
So actually one question that I see asked here, which kind of relates to that I'm not sure either of you or neither of you may know the answer to this. One participant here is asking, were there taxes imposed on imported wines into the early days of the Dublin port? So we're talking 300.
Yeah, no, wine would have been a taxable, same with tobacco. And a bit like today with tobacco, that's what's smuggled into the country. So smuggling is a big thing in the 1700s, and very popular, as you can imagine. And it's only with the introduction of the Irish Constabulary, or the Royal Irish Constabulary, in the 1830s, and a revenue police. So a revenue police is introduced around 1818, with their own ships, that you start to see smuggling starts to die off. But smuggling wouldn't have happened into the port, where they would normally have worked their way along the east coast. A kind of prominent area of smuggling would be in Rush, in North County Dublin. And some of the most prominent smugglers would have been Rush families who had their own ships and had very long connections back to France. So again, you find some parts of those families would have emigrated to France, set it up there as merchants. So you had family connections between the two countries. And during the wars between France and England in the 1790s and later, you found a lot of these families actually joining up as in the French Navy, not into the British Navy or the English Navy. So again, smuggling of wine. Not sure how much is being taxed at the time. I'm sure we could find one or two academic books to tell us that. But yeah, no, it's they're like today. They're things that are easily taxed and easily measured.
Okay.
Far too easily taxed for my liking, has to be said. But I won't get into that because I'll start a rant and okay. I won't get a word in.
And ironically, in the last 10 years, I mean, tobacco smuggling now into Dublin Port is, and even this week, the revenue captured more cigarettes have been smuggled in because as cigarettes have increased in price, the smuggling of that has taken off. So again, when you look at the reports in the newspapers in the 1700s of wine being smuggled in, it's also huge amounts of tobacco also being smuggled in, some direct from places like Brazil.
Ed, to go back to one or two other questions that people have put in here, someone's looking for a recommendation to put with something like a meaty fish, like a monkfish.
Santa Rita Rose 2018 would be lovely. It really depends on how you're sourcing it. So, if you're going to do it in some kind of lemony sauce, then go for something that maybe has a citrusy note to it. But because it's quite a meaty and a dense fish, if you're going for a white wine, I'd think of something like a white Burgundy that's got a good bit of body. So a Chardonnay from Burgundy or from the New World. Perhaps with a bit of oak to it, but still with a bit of freshness. And if you think about the weight of the wine and the weight of the dish, if you go for a heavier style of dish, go for a slightly heavier style of wine. If you want to go for a red wine, maybe go for something, I wouldn't suggest going for a big Cabernet Sauvignon, but maybe something lighter like a Pinot Noir or a Gamay, so from Beaujolais, or something like a Carignan from Chile, perhaps. Or Sanso, something lighter and fresher. But again, go to your local independent and ask for their advice, because they'll give you a good steer.
Right. That's a sound piece of advice, and I think actually that makes me kind of curious. As you said, it's all about personal taste and personal interest. say you yourself are at home on a Saturday afternoon and you've got all the time in the kitchen that you want. What are you going to cook yourself, and what's the preferred bottle of choice? Like, what's your ideal meal?
Oh, it's very hard to say. Lamb and Cabernet. I love a shank of lamb that's braised for hours, served with creamy buttery mash and a lovely Bordeaux, or if I'm really treating myself, something like Casa Real Cabernet from Maipo in Chile, which is, for my mind, one of the greatest wines. So that's kind of what I would go for. But I love everything really, so it kind of doesn't really matter. I love all styles of wine and I like all styles of food. So whether it's fish, meat, vegetables, Chinese, Indian, pizza, Italian, I love everything. So there's very little that I don't like, and I'll always find something to drink.
Your enthusiasm is very apparent.
And having talked about kind of wine pairing and matching, like a lot of my job in the past has been matching wines for dishes that chefs have put up and for customers who are eating them. But I have to temper that with that you can just throw that out the window. And there are people who subscribe to the idea of food and wine matching, and other people who say, no, that's all just made up by people who are trying to screw more money out of you in a restaurant setting. And that's not quite fair, but it does hold a bit of water in that, look, drink what you like, eat what you like. And if you have some sommelier going, oh, but you are having so you must not drink this Pinot Noir, then you can just go, get out of here. You're just, this is what I like. If I'm wrong, well then,
it's my choice.
I'm not going to listen to you. It's my choice. Yeah. So you drink what you like and you eat what you like. I would very much subscribe to that.
Okay. And I guess kind of if we're talking about, say you were alluding to, say, your time in the likes of, say, Chapter 1 or Glover Alley, like for those of us who are trying to kind of host and create nice experiences for friends and loved ones, obviously good food and good wine is vital, but, hospitality as is provided in a fine dining environment it's such an impressive accomplishment when done well. And I guess I'm wondering if there's any advice that you can give to people trying to achieve these moments.
Well, I suppose, hospitality, like true hospitality, comes from actually genuinely being glad to see people and genuinely wanting them to have a good time. And that's really the key to it. So if you're having people around, just make sure that you're having them around for the right reasons, and, that you like them. And if you like them, everything is going to be fine, and they will forgive pretty much anything. Like if you get stuck in the kitchen, or if you overcook the beef, or if you undercook the salmon, or whatever it happens to be, people will forgive you because you're all mates. I suppose it's more difficult if you're trying to entertain somebody at home who's maybe a business client, or someone you're trying to impress your boss or something like that. But I would say just keep it simple. That's really is the best advice. Be genuine, keep it simple, and don't try and overshoot things. Sometimes some of the most disappointing wines that you can try are ones that are north of £100 a bottle.
Okay.
Because the expectation is so high. And you might have this person around that you're trying to impress, and you've spent like £100 on this bottle of wine, and you open it, you kind of go, well, that wasn't very nice. And sometimes those wines aren't very nice if you don't drink them at the right time. So, it might need another 15 years of bottle age, or it might have had too much bottle age, or it might have been stored correctly, or whatever. So, don't go too far out of your comfort zone would be my advice. Don't go buying really expensive Bordeaux or Burgundies if that's not what you usually buy. Kind of stick to what and maybe push the boundaries of that a little bit, but don't go too far with it. Don't go wild, because that's when you can kind of upset yourself. In restaurant settings, I would often have people who would say to me, I've got this bottle of wine that somebody gave me, and it's a Santa Million Grand Cru, or it's a this, or it's a that, and, when should I drink it? And I've had it for 15 years. And, well, where is it? Oh, it's in my kitchen. Well, where in your kitchen? Well, I've got a wine rack over my fridge. And I'm going, oh, God. No, that's the wrong place to have it, because wine hates fluctuation in temperature and stuff like that. And my advice would always be, pick a rainy Tuesday or a Wednesday evening and have it with a burger or have it with a pizza or something like that, because if it's disappointing, you're not going to lose out. And if it's amazing, well, then you've had a really good Tuesday or Wednesday night. Instead of, people put these trophy wines up on a pedestal. Sometimes the expectation is so high that those are the wines that can really disappoint. And the wines that sometimes really impress you are the ones that you're not expecting. So your local wine merchant has said, "Oh, try this. I think it's amazing." And it's $12.99, and you have it, and it knocks your socks off. That's what I like. You don't have to spend huge amounts of money to get a lot of pleasure out of wine.
That's sound advice. It really is. And you made reference there to say past customers or clients who would kind of ask your advice on the wines over the course of kind of a meal. And I guess working in the hospitality environment, it is quite a unique and interesting environment. And I wonder, if you're sitting around a table having dinner with your own friends, is there any interesting stories that you might tell about your secrets and insights?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's probably lots of stories. I mean, there are the serial complainers who, that every time that they come to your establishment, they're going to complain, and you don't know what it's going to be, but they will always have a complaint about something. There's lots of funny stories. I remember one night, a group of it was two couples actually who'd been at the races that day. And they were a little bit inebriated when they arrived, and they sat down and they were having such a good time that the volume was getting louder and louder and louder, to the point where there was a table just about 2 meters away from them across the room, which was an American family. And the kids, there was a mother and father and 2 kids, and the kids, I say, were like 8 and 10 perhaps. And the 10-year-old boy was wearing like a blazer and a tie, and his hair was very prim and proper. And this table across from them were getting louder and louder, and to the point where one of them got up to go to the loo and fell backwards onto the ground. And the manager had to go and ask them to sling their hook and go, "Oh, sorry boss, oh, we were at the races, we won a bit of money on the races today," and it was like, but they were really nice about it. But it's just really fun. It can be quite scary, and I'm glad that I didn't have to deal with them, because you have to be very delicate, particularly when people have a few drinks on board, if they're not enjoying their alcohol sensibly, which we all obviously would, and I would encourage anybody to do. But yeah, I was glad it wasn't me who had to delicately ask them to vacate the premises, but they did, and they were fine with it. But and the Americans thought that this was great. This is the Irish. This is what they do. Yeah, perhaps not.
Okay, that's a first impression for sure.
Yeah.
I'm going to just touch on and see if we have any questions coming in here. That Lar, a couple of questions for yourself here. One of our participants is wondering, what kind of an impact did the abolition of the customs clearance have on the port and its environs?
That would probably relate into the Maastricht Treaty, which is the 1990s. When that was passed, customs and revenue kind of disappeared from the port. They're still there. There's a building called the New Custom House. And they do spot checks on vehicles at the moment. And they have an X-ray machines on big trucks, so you can see them X-raying containers and things like that. So it did speed up the whole operation of material moving between Europe and from United Kingdom over to Ireland. And you do have situations where supply lines now are very, very short. So you'll see Marks and Spencer's trucks coming off ferries at 6 o'clock in the morning, going into town, unloading, and often they'll be back for the 8 o'clock sailing back to Holyhead. So what's happened with those customs disappearing in the 1990s is that everything kind of sped up. At the moment, a truck spends about 12 minutes in the port. So when it comes off a ferry, within 12 minutes, it'll probably, it will be at the tunnel, and it will be on the M50 very, very quickly in the early in the morning. That's why a lot of the ferries come in between 6 and 7. And then there's other trucks then coming in to go out on the 8 o'clock sailings. So, it sped up everything. And the change that we see in the world is that supply lines now are kind of fairly short. shops don't have big warehouses or big storerooms anymore. Everything is kind of on a phone away. And even with the lockdown, I mean, the company or the port itself and the various companies working there, they've remained open. So, I mean, they're very important to kind of keep the supply chains. The modern port company runs, it's like a landlord. It runs the facility, it runs the roads, the infrastructure. But there are a large number of stevedoring companies that do the unloading, and then you have the 4 ferry companies. So it's a big operation. The company itself only employs about 150 people, but within the port area is about 5,000 people. And again, if you go down there, you'll see the trucks flying in and flying out. So it's very, very, very busy. I spotted a question there about Brexit. I mean, Brexit will bring back some of the 1990s, or what happened there before the 1990s, which is traffic coming from England will slow down. And over the last 2 years, a lot of infrastructure is being built down there. So if people are going down to the ferry, if they do go away for the summer months to France or to the UK, you will see a lot more Brexit zones, as they're called. So there's more inspection areas. And that's actually all being built. It's been built now about well over a year. Extra staff have been hired with customs and revenue. So the system is in train to kind of deal with it. And we'll see what happens at the end of the year. But it's definitely a lot better when, in 2016 when Brexit happened. So since then, this infrastructure has been built, the staffing has been hired. What you find out, again, from as a historian kind of working down there, it's not just customs and revenue. Department of Agriculture have to have vets. Vets have to inspect animals coming in and out. You need to have laboratories to test. And then European regulations are quite strict. If you're not part of the European Union, everything from soil samples to containers will have to be opened and double checked and rechecked, which goes back to the way the system ran before Maastricht. Is that that's what your customs person did, is they stopped your car and they could kind of search you, and going from one country to another was a slow process. And if you met or came across a customs person who wanted to make your day difficult, that was the way it was going to be. So all those systems have been put in, inspection areas, inspection zones have been put in. And a lot of these are just regulations that, whether it's a hard Brexit or it's the one that we'd like a negotiated one, there's going to be regulations, and people are going to have checklists, and things are going to have to be inspected. So things will slow down.
Okay, I do remember traveling an artifact into Dublin a few years ago and spending 12 hours in an airport. That was one of the longer days' work that I can remember. But I guess, Lara, obviously a key part of your work down in the port is overseeing and minding the archive. And I guess in the last couple of years when you've been going through it, I wonder if you'd have a standout anecdote or artifact that you've come across that really just resonated with yourself, one of your favorite pieces.
I had lots of favorite pieces. It's a very visual archive. So when we think about archives, and you had Katrina Crowe on, it's probably Ireland's most famous archivist. Archives are about paper and they require a bit of interpretation. What's nice about our archive, it's very visual. So when I joined, I think they told me we had about 13,000 photographs. That figures up to about 75,000 photographs now. So you can now, the things I've talked about, that expansion of Dublin, from the 1860s on, we can actually show by photographs of the expansion right up into the present day. So for me, it's the photographic collection, and there are loads of gems on that. You'll find them on our website, Dublin Port Archive website. And in particular, some very nice color photographs that we put up recently, which are really, they're a Technochrome, which is, it's just very vibrant, and you kind of get an idea of what the port looked like in the 50s and 60s. And then there's a very, very important map and charts collection, which again is very visual, and it kind of shows you that expansion of Dublin, and it kind of gives you the kind of a flavor of a bygone era. So yeah, no, I mean, it's for me, it's there's too much to pick one or two. And then also, I mean, we've started doing interviews in oral history projects with current staff members or retired members, trying to add on to the archive, which is kind of the oral history. And then you have retired dockers in the area have also recorded their memories of their experiences, and they could, you'll see a lot of that online, but also before the lockdown, we're doing regular lectures and explaining how the life was before containerization in the 70s and 80s. So between the archive itself and those kind of stories out there, and some wonderful people in the area who've kind of maintained that and preserved that, there's a lot of stories that we can tell in the Port area.
And you do have a number of heritage projects that have been being established around the port and that part of the city over the last couple of years.
Yeah, for many years there was what was called the diving bell was on the South Quays, and it was kind of looked very sad and it needed interpretation. So in 2015, the company decided to invest in kind of restoring the diving bell, and then raising it off the ground and building a small museum underneath. So my colleague Jim Keller did that work, and bringing it to life with kind of graphic panels underneath. So it's Dublin's smallest museum now. It gets about 100,000 people a year. You know, it's about a 5 or 10 minutes if you read all the graphic panels. But it just gives you an idea of the importance. You know, an overlooked piece of industrial heritage, which was this diving bell. Without that, the quay walls wouldn't have been built. And it was a very novel invention in the 1860s by Bindon Bloodstoney, who was the senior engineer. But by just kind of going underneath the bell now, you kind of learn about that and how he kind of sped up the whole process of building quay walls, and that allows bigger and bigger ships to come into the port. So it's kind of it's a knock-on impact. Since then, the port centre, where the headquarters is, just off the Eastwold Road, has been regalvanised and restored, and a maritime garden built in there. And then throughout the port, we have a lot of heritage buildings. So for the next couple of years, we're working on some of our old ESB substations, a graving dock area, which is a dry dock area where ships used to be built and repaired. And then we have an old mill area, which is, if you're driving to the airport from the south side, you'll see some very large steel silos with oddlums on the side of them. And the port has taken over that area, and we're working with the famous architects, Grafton architects, to look at how we can kind of allow and get citizens from the city down into this area to kind of experience the port, explain some of the history, but also to kind of right in the center of the port experience what a busy port looks like today. So a lot of these projects in line now at the moment. So it's kind of very focused on trying to get people in and get them to see what we see every day.
Okay, well, that's fascinating. I see one person here has asked if there's any possibilities of a collaboration between the little museum and the port, and I can promise that we're working on that behind the scenes, that you guys have been really good and kind supporters of us, which we appreciate. So I think watch this space.
Watch this space, yes, definitely.
Correct response there. And I guess one question that I see here, Ed, that you might chat to us about is, there's a user here who's asking about if there's many wine producers here in Ireland.
Not many, but there are a couple. I believe David Denizen down in Waterford is making some wine. I haven't seen David in years, and I haven't tasted his wine. There are a couple that I know and I've dealt with recently. The Wicklow Way Wines, who are based down in Newtown Mount Kennedy, and they make a fantastic strawberry wine, and they're also making blackberry wine, and I think they have a couple of other things as well. But I know the strawberry wine went really well. I had it listed a couple of years ago. There was a dessert that we were doing in the restaurant, which was, sounds a bit mad, but it was a bread and, was it brown bread, ice cream with a buttermilk, brown bread and buttermilk, basically, this ice cream dish. And then when you put the strawberry wine with it, it was just like bread and jam. It was lovely. It just worked really, really nicely, and it went really, really well. And I know that they, you know, from a fairly small start, they very quickly progressed, and you know that their wine was being served at Wimbledon and things like that. So you know they've done really well. But obviously it's not technically wine, because wine has to be made with grapes. So they're making it with other fruits, but local fruits. But there is a guy up in Lusk called David Llewellyn, who is making wine. He's growing Cabernet Sauvignon. He's growing various different things. He's just released his first sparkling wine, and it's surprisingly good. I had some of his Cabernet Sauvignon when I was working in Chapter 1, and I listed it by the glass just because people were curious. And I remember Italians sort of coming in and saying, oh, well, you know, we're eating the local cuisine, you must drink the local wine. And I was saying, well, you don't have to. Like, there's, you know, another 500 wines on the list here if you want. No, we'll have this. oh, that's lovely, we'll have another bottle, you know, and it was, you know, they didn't think anything of it. Whereas for a lot of us, we kind of go, Irish wine, what, how can that be? And I still don't quite know how it can be, like how he does use polytunnels to ripen his Cabernet Sauvignon. But I mean, Cabernet Sauvignon generally is a wine that needs, or a grape that needs a lot of heat and a lot of sun. Yeah. But look out, I know you can buy it in Mitchell's and a few other places as well. But it's in Lusk in North County Dublin. It's his winery. But I mean, that's not his bread and butter. He has orchards, he grows apples, he makes cider and vinegars and, you know, pears and perry and all kinds of things. So a really interesting character. So look out for David. You'll see him at a lot of the farmers markets. He may not have wine with him at the markets, or he may.
Okay. Well, as someone whose favourite dessert is bread and butter pudding, you unfortunately have that front and centre in my brain right now.
Okay. So you'll get yourself a bottle of the strawberry wine then. It's gorgeous.
Yeah, that may well happen. So I guess kind of I'm going to give you a challenging question, I hope, to someone who is so kind of enthusiastic, shall we say, about all things wine. If you're going to, you know, the cliche question, if you're going to a desert island and, okay, you can bring 2 bottles of wine with you, could you tell us about what you'd bring and why?
I suppose I'd start off with a big red, probably something with a bit of bottle age, depending on how long it's going to take me to drink it. And when I say big, I mean probably a Magnum or a Jeroboam. So, you know, 1.5 or 3 litre bottle. You didn't specify the size of the bottle, but, you know, the bigger the better. So something like Cazaret, which I mentioned earlier, is fabulous. Or any of the top Bordeaux's. I'm a great fan of Léville Barton in Saint-Julien. I think that's lovely, particularly with the bottle age. And they're lovely people. And I think, you know, really nice people make really good wine. It just seems to be a thing. And then the second bottle would have to be white Burgundy, probably. And again, a Magnum or a double Magnum. Or something like Morachet. If, you know, price is no object, you don't have to pay for it. Like the Morachet.
I respect the loophole that you found in that. I wasn't prescriptive enough on that one. And I guess so, to ask your own kind of, we're now at the point where obviously restaurants have been closed for the last 3 odd months now at this stage, and we're on course to reopen, and we're all kind of beavering away behind the scenes making plans. I know we in the museum are heavily underway in our planning. How do you think the next few months looks for the industry? What does this Operation Brave New World, as we're calling it, look like?
It's very hard to know, and they're still trying to work out the fine details, and there's still questions about 2 meters versus 1.5 meters versus 1 meter. I see that it looks like they're going to be allowing hairdressers to open on the 29th of June as well. And well, your hairdresser can't be 2 meters away from you. So how is that going to work? And I think we're going to see a lot of restaurateurs saying, well, if they're allowed to cut someone's hair, why are we not allowed to be 1 meter away from, you know, I don't know. It just seems a little dodgy. And I don't know. They need to iron out the details on it. It's going to be really hard. It's going to be really tough. That, you know, restaurants are going to suffer from smaller numbers. They won't be able to employ as many staff. The staff they do employ probably won't be earning as much. A lot of would rely on the tipping culture that we have here, and that's obviously going to be depleted if there's less customers that they're looking after. So it's going to be really tough all round. And I think unless the government helps with whatever incentives that they can use to try and reinvigorate the industry, and it's not just restaurants, it's hospitality in general. So hotels, guest houses, B&Bs, restaurants, cafes, visitor centres, the whole thing. Everyone is going to suffer. So I think without an influx of tourists, which we won't have this year, even when the airports reopen and airlines start flying again, I think there's going to be people will not travel unless they have to. I don't think. That, you know, we're going to have to just support our own local hospitality businesses. So, you know, go out and have dinner in your local restaurant, or go into town and have dinner, whatever, treat yourself. You know, none of us have gone out for 3 months. So, you know, we can hopefully, some of us can afford to like splash out and just treat ourselves, and hopefully re-engage with the great people who work in the hospitality industry in Ireland. And I mean, hospitality is one of those things we really excel at in this country, because we just have it in us, in our personalities, that we're, you know, the 100,000 welcomes, as I know you guys are really big on that in the Little Museum. So we just need to support our Indigenous industry.
Okay, and I guess this is a question that applies to both of you. What one restaurant are you looking forward to going to when all of this reopens?
Well, I don't get out much. Or at least I haven't got out much in the past, because I was always working when other restaurants were open. So I'm just looking forward to going out. There are too many to mention. I mean, I've been working my way through in the last year or so all the restaurants that I never got a chance to eat in, but I haven't come anywhere near the end of that list. So I'm just looking forward to going out and just re-engaging with food and wine again, and the people who serve it.
Lar, would you have any?
No, it's been too long. I'm really looking forward to just going out, and I hope the restaurants can open as quickly as possible, as we all would like. I just know from our own house, it would be pizza on Fridays. We had a tradition of going to a local pizza restaurant. So for us, it's just it's a social side, just what Ed's talking about. At the end of a week, just the four of us going out and having a nice pizza, a beer or a glass of wine, and just that kind of routine is now. I think it's almost 90 days of this, so
yeah,
it's been a long time. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to just going back into a routine of at the end of the week going out on Friday.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I guess,
and being able to meet friends as well. I mean, that's going to be great.
Sure, yeah. Lar, one question that was asked here, which I'm going to ask you as a two-part question. A few people have asked, can they view any of the Port's archive online? You might just tell us there.
Sure. DublinPortArchive.com is the website, and we're regularly uploading material onto the website. As for having a reading room, and a kind of a proper archive building at the moment, they're part of the plans that we have working with Grafton Architects is to build that. But if anyone has a query or a specific query, there's an email address there which is linked to my email. And please just send in your questions and we'll answer as best as we can. Like any archive, we have a lot of material in one particular area, and then there could be gaps in others. But overall, it does give a very comprehensive view of the last 300 years. And I just encourage you, email your inquiries. I've worked in museums and archives before. Lots of the collection isn't fully catalogued yet, but we're getting there, and we're working on that with a team at the moment to do that and get more material. But please send in your inquiries. I'm happy to answer them.
That's wonderful, Lar. Thank you very much. And I see people commenting about looking forward to the Little Museum reopening, and we do have the 29th of June confirmed as our reopening date, and we're kind of working behind the scenes and preparing for that. We're going to open as a slightly kind of smaller experience as we kind of build up to reopening to business as normal, just to kind of start as we wish to go on, shall we put it that way.
So you'll be able to come into town, have a haircut, go for a bite to eat, and come to the Little Museum. Not necessarily in that order, though.
Sounds like a great day. Yeah. You'll notice my hair is up this evening. It's getting to that point. But anyway, listen, Lar and Ed, it's been really so lovely this evening. I sincerely appreciate you both taking the time and being so generous with your stories. So thank you both so much. Really, very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Very nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
So this is the end of this week's 120 Dublin Stories. Next week, we're going to move countries, actually. We're going to come to Spain for our wine tasting, and we're going to be joined by a Carlos Delan from Cune, which is CVNE, and we're going to be tasting a crianza. So we're going to taste something slightly different this coming week. See Ed smiling. It's something you may have tasted yourself in the past.
Well, no, I know Carlos. I was in Spain with him last year. He's a good guy, and the wines are cracking.
Great. Well,
Yeah.
You've heard it here first. Perfect. Well, I'll send a note out around about it. But to everyone, thank you again so much for joining us. And cheers.
Cheers.
Launch it.
Sláinte.
So good night, everyone. Bye. See you later.